All right, let's get started. Welcome, everybody, and thanks for being here tonight. My name is Daniel Sauter. I'm an associate professor of data visualization, and it's my real pleasure tonight to welcome you to Parsons School of Design and the data visualization keynote specifically, which is what we are thinking of our blockbuster event for the season. So thanks for being here. Also, some of you traveled really from far and some very, very far. So it's time to acknowledge that and say thank you for all of your family and loved one who are here to support you and who want to see what you have been up to for the last year and the last semester in particular. So I know you're wondering what happened during this spring semester, but also what's going to happen as folks are going into their futures. So I would like to first say that really rumors have it that Aaron and I are really very keen that we are always supporting this cohort, and it's our favorite night of the year. And so it's a celebration. It's really a party with talks. So think of it like this, and I need really your help to celebrate the students tonight. And I just want to practice and warm up. And I want to warm up by thanking Aaron, who has been the fearless leader and director of this program for 4 years. So let's make some noise for Aaron and thank him. So the graduates have prepared quick-fire presentations that really have high energy, and I'm hoping that you're going to enjoy the 4 themes of this night, and one of them is arts and leisure. That's the first group. The second group will be health and livelihood, then followed by media and society, and then data and policy. So I'm just going to quickly mention the lineup, and then my main job is to get out of the way. And let's see. First, arts and leisure. Nic is going to talk about what might it take for people to care about their data. Simone's going to talk about a proposed model for art reparation. And Emily's going to talk about audience experience and musical performances. Claire about trends in museum staffing and collection acquisitions. And Kiril about travel in women's professional tennis. So let's bring up our first speaker for tonight, Nic, right there.
All right, there we go. So I'm Nic Stark. I'm here to talk to you about your personal data. Nobody really cares about theirs, and I think that's a bit of a shame. We see it in the news that it's been leaked. We give it away to companies without really thinking about what we're really giving them. And personal data is important and useful, right? Otherwise, other people wouldn't want it. But we don't really care. We have a very non-existent association with the data that we produce. And I think that's for 2 reasons. First is that data is abstract, right? That's why visualization is such a powerful tool, is that we can see it when it's been visualized. And I think the second reason is that nobody's building tools for us to visualize our personal data. So about 6 months ago, I set out to visualize my own personal data. And I created this chart of all the data that exists about me and how I can access it. And when I started thinking about what it would look like, I really struggled because I hadn't really realized that it was a full reflection of myself and who I am, who I talk to, how I spend my day. And then when I realized the reflection is there, but it's a very rudimentary version. It's a protozoic version of myself. So I looked to the Cambrian era as inspiration for a framework to design these visualizations. So we can easily fast forward 50 years and think about when it's a more evolved version and a very clear reflection of who we are. But right now it is this protozoic animal, this protozoic reflection. So these simple organisms from the Cambrian area were my main inspiration. And I went about creating one for each day of my life. So here we see about the last 2 years of my life visualized, each as an individual little critter. And each part of their anatomy is represented by a separate data stream that is created automatically as I go about my day, right? So we have the head is my sleep, and chronologically going down the spine. We have the distance that I've traveled. Each of the arms is a conversation that I had with a person. And it was pretty interesting to see how just creating these changed my personal relationship to my data. And I started thinking as I went through my day about what kind of bug I was creating by who I was talking to, how often I was talking to them, whether or not I was walking around or taking the subway. And I think that this is a key aspect to building relationships with our personal data, is being able to see them and being able to understand that our actions have tangible consequences in what our personal data holds. So here's a taxonomy view of a collection of them. And as we scroll through, we can see larger trends. So you'll notice that the deep sleep rings around the head actually disappear for a long period of time when I stopped wearing my smartwatch. And of course, these analytics aren't that important, right? And I think that's why a lot of people start wearing smartwatches and stop wearing them. But I think that they help design a paradigm for us to understand what data that we are creating and understand how it can be used. So because not everybody wants to be a bug, I also designed 2 other colorways. So you can choose to be a bug or a plant or a jellyfish. You'll see those coming up in a second. But the idea here is that if these were living amongst you, if you had to interact with these every day, would you begin to treat them differently? And what sort of relationship would you foster with yourself and with your personal data? So I really can't tell you how excited I am to continue working on this project. I think I'd love to do a real hardware prototype. And I invite you, if you have any questions or care about your personal data yourself, to get in touch with me. And you can play with these yourself. And if you're feeling up to the challenge, you can generate your own. The source code is on my website, nicstark.com/Cambrian Analytica. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Simone, and my thesis is titled Repatriation, an Approach for a Fair Museum. I created a model to determine if an item should be returned to its original community. I also mapped repatriation cases worldwide. Let's enter the exhibit and get started. You may be wondering, what exactly is repatriation? Repatriation is defined as the restoration of something to its rightful owner. Museums have artifacts from all over the world, but not all of them were obtained in the same way. We're coming to terms with the fact that some items were removed in a suspicious manner. The issue here is that if a group or community makes a request for an object's return, there is no universal repatriation process. Usually there's a power dynamic at play where the colonized people or marginalized people don't have a say in the outcome of the repatriation discussions. I would like the process to be more equitable for marginalized communities and for museum goers to have more awareness of the provenance of their artifacts, as well as for them to think critically about this. Let's explore a few case studies that have mapped of artifact movement around the world and what has or hasn't been repatriated so far. Here we can hover over the lines to see the origin and destination of certain artifacts. We see a lot of movement in the African continent. Astoundingly, 90% of Africa's heritage lies outside the continent. The Elgin marbles have been a point of contention for Greek and British relations. The Greek really want these sculptures returned. However, the British Museum has so far refused every return request. Next, I'm going to explain the 4 pillars of the methodology and how they came up to make up the model. The 4 pillars making up the methodology include symbolism. Does this item have symbolic value for a community? Legality. Does this item was this item taken in a consensual manner? Preservation, will the item be preserved? Morality, is there a power imbalance between the requester and the requestee? Is the artifact part of the public's discussion? Now, what if we applied this model to a random sample of 5,000 items from the Met's collection? The 4 metrics are then summed and separated into shelves. Here we see that the model only called out 2% of the sample as artifact deemed contentious, and 0.4% as contenders for repatriation. We can likely say that the Met is doing a decent job at maintaining an ethical collection. You can hover to see every item making up the shelves, and we can click on different colored circles for in-depth case studies into why certain artifacts were chosen this way. The model picked out this particular item, stone mail and parka with harpoon, because it meets the preservation material metric as a stone sculpture and the geographical location of where this item was made, Canada. The Inuit were historically marginalized, so this meets the legality metric. Also, the provenance of this item is not entirely clear. On the Met's website, it said to be from Port Harrison in northern Quebec, James A. Houston, New York, until 1969. Next are more details into the specifics of the calculations that went into every metric, and I invite you to read this section when exploring the visualization. To conclude, this experiment and potential framework was created as a conversation starter, essentially a neutral voice in the repatriation discussions. Ethnographic museums have been keepers of other people's culture, imposing their own classifications and interpretations onto objects from other peoples around the world. Indigenous groups rarely had a voice. Museums hold a special place in my heart as a place of solace, reflection, beauty, and exploration. They're a reflection of society at large and provide a great service. As societies try to atone for past behaviors, fair museums are an important part of righting past wrongs. Thank you.
Experiencing Notes on Perspective. What we're watching is basically a news feed, but only for an event where people are listening to Fantasy Shtuka, Opus 73 by Robert Schumann. And what we're seeing are very sophisticated remarks, like, I really like that dispose, and people are agreeing with things like this. There's also things like, okay, the opening section is stuck. Where are we? We're at a music school, and we're at a music school, and people are experiencing thoughts and feelings and agreeing or disagreeing with each other. If you see anything that is gold, that's a positive reaction. If you see anything that is violet, that is a negative reaction. And if you see anything that's blue, it's a mixed or neutral reaction. We're going to go into a theater or situated view to experience how people feel throughout the performance. In this view, all the faces are people's roles. So these are the people at the event. They're an ensemble class. That's the performing pianist. That's the performing cellist. When people were pulsating, that means they were continuously experiencing a feeling. And when they had a fleeting feeling, it only glowed for a second before fading away. We're now going to graduate to a more sophisticated view of all of this data in what I call a perception view. There's a lot of data happening here. So the colors that you see in the background, that's based on a color version of the score. And how this was created is through machine learning, where musical notation and sequential progression created different themes, such as melody, magic, building, emerging, and drama. These names I came up with myself. When we look at the rest of the impression, what happens is that every single white spot on the disc represents a person at this performance. So what we're seeing here is that these 3 performers are experiencing a negative reaction. Too much Roland Hondo, and they're all agreeing with this. Class member 6, class member 8, are all experiencing a mixed reaction that while the cellist is playing beautifully, they wish the pianist would have played it much softer, like it was dying or falling asleep. There's also a lot of other stories and moments that you can dive into. And while this application was only created for this specific performance, my hope is that we can use this type of visualization to visualize so many other types of events, keynotes, town halls, concerts, because what we're really trying to do is make thoughts and feelings more tangible. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Clare Churchouse, and my project is, if we get rid of the no results found, sorry. Okay, I'm just gonna restart here, sorry. I'm looking at whether museums reflect us as a society. I examine who staffs local museums and national museums and who visits them and what artworks they contain, and I investigate whether acquisitions and staffing have changed in the past 5 years. There were 2 baseline staff demographic surveys released in 2015, and my focus is on staffing as it relates to race and ethnicity. The New York City Department of Cultural Affairs released one survey locally, and the other was a National Art Museum staff demographic survey. I used Brooklyn Museum's API to examine artworks by nationality, and so I can address recent acquisition trends. This interface looks at the DCLA data set, and I filtered it to show paid staff and board members at museums with budgets over $1 million. And the survey records job types, as you can see along the top, by race and ethnicity groupings. Yellow shows the number of people in each job type, and the pink tracks single ethnic and racial groups along the horizontal axis. Clicking on the green button, you can sort vertically by job type to show the percent again. Racial diversity varies by job type. You can see here that facilities are more diverse than boards. Here you can see that 14% of education staff are Black or African American as compared to 2% of curators. And white leadership has the highest leadership has the highest percentage of white non-Hispanic staff at 88%. And the job types are ordered by seniority from the left to the right. Overall, 38% of that data set of people identified as people of color, whereas New York City is 67%. I did a dive into the curators because they're the ones who work with the artwork, and took a look at hiring changes in the last 5 years. And you can see that Hispanics saw a 75% increase in recent hiring, 2010 to 15. And white non-Hispanic staff saw a 66% increase. There was also the National Art Museum survey of 2015, which was followed by a 2018 survey, and that indicated increased representational diversity, but again, not across all job positions. And so my second part was I looked at artworks to see if there were changes in acquisition history. Nationality and race are different concepts and categorization systems. Museums typically record an artist's nationality, not race and ethnicity. So here I've grouped the Brooklyn data set in the contemporary collection by nationality of artist. There's 60 individual nationalities, and 39 indicate multiple groupings where people have moved from one country to another. And I colored the circles by continent. To discern trends, I split this, these 99 by the artworks acquired before 2015 and those acquired on the right-hand side after that. There's 289 artworks acquired by artists from 15 countries after 2015. There's a decline in the percentage of American artworks from 68 to 40%, but actually if you count the Anglo-American artworks, that percentage has gone up from 74 to 78%. No artworks from Africa were acquired in the last 5 years. This investigation suggests an institutional mandate to increase diversity at the staffing level, but this mandate is not evident in the realm of acquisitions here. And even with this mandate, in 2015 at the leadership level, positions were 88% white in New York City funded museums with budgets over $1 million. Thank you.
Hello everyone, my name is Kiril Traykov and I'm going to give you a crash course on women's tennis. Tennis is different from other sports with the fact that there are no home games for the players and there are no regional conferences. So travel is an imminent fact of a tennis player's life. So looking at the big picture, and let's make this a real court. Looking at the big picture, I am going to talk about the Women's Tennis Association. It is a tour of 58 annual tournaments played over 46 weeks. There are 6 tournament categories, and you probably have heard about the 4 big Grand Slams every year. And not surprisingly so, because they account for 52% of the annual prize fund, which is $165 million. A player's ranking is determined by her best 17 tournaments played in a given year. 8 of these tournaments are mandatory, so that leaves 9 more spots for her to choose where to travel. However, because a player can substitute one poor result by traveling to another tournament, the top 20 actually plays 21 tournaments per year on average. So if we examine what the weekly schedule looks like, you can see here all 58 tournaments with the green boxes representing the Grand Slams. So we're currently in week 21 of the season where the players are in Rome. We see that last year, out of the 30 top players, 5 went to Strasbourg, 2 went to Nuremberg, so 7 of them went to play one more week before the second Grand Slam of the year, which is the French Open in week 23-24. Once the French Open is over, the players are going to prepare for Wimbledon or enter the grass season. So here we see a lot of different choices that the players make, with 6 of them actually choosing to go straight to Wimbledon without any preparation on grass. So how does it look by individual player? You probably have heard about Naomi Osaka. Naomi won the US Open last year. So what you see here is a plot showing how many kilometers she traveled in the year and the cumulative points that she earned. So we see that at the beginning of the year she did quite okay in Australia, but then she made a big jump here. She traveled somewhere and she earned a lot of points. This is represented by her winning the Indian Wells in California. Then we see she went to play a lot of tournaments which were close by in the middle of the year, but she didn't gain a lot of points there. That is until the US Open, when she came to New York and she was victorious here, defeating Serena Williams in the final, so we see this big jump. Another player you may have heard is Angelique Kerber. Angelique won Wimbledon, arguably the best, the most famous tournament of the sport. So we see she started strong in Australia. She then flattened a little bit, and she came almost out of nowhere to win Wimbledon, and again defeats Serena Williams in the final. So if we take a look at Serena Williams, she ended the year as number 16, probably uncharacteristic for her. She returned from maternity leave last year, so she only played 7 tournaments. This is why she is ranked number 16, despite going to the finals of both the French Open and, the finals of Wimbledon and the US Open. Now, she also boasts the best travel efficiency of 8 kilometers per 1 ranking point, which is something that probably even Super Mario cannot accomplish. So now if we want to answer the question of if we want to compare the players, how much they traveled, we can graph all of them. And here, by examining the x-axis for kilometers traveled, we can see that we have our winner here, who is Mikaela Buzărnescu. She traveled more than 100,000 kilometers. And if we examine her record, we see that she only picked up in the second half of the year, and here she actually played. Let's see if we can do this. Played 4 to 5 tournaments in a row, which is very bizarre. And we see a gap here. This gap is coming from the fact that she actually got injured, and probably that came as a result of overplaying. So in sum, out of this research, looking at the travel and the efficiency of such travel, we can formulate a new rule of thumb that in order to be in the top 10, a player needs to achieve an efficiency of 20 kilometers for 1 ranking point and play a full schedule at the same time. Thank you very much.
We hope to see you all tomorrow at the US Open for the graduation ceremony. So moving into the next category, health and livelihood. Candice is going to discuss the branding and commercialization of opioids. Colleen is going to talk about the role of crowdfunding in the US healthcare system. Batool about standardized blood test results. Felix about universal income guarantees, and Mikaela about women's reproductive rights. So let's bring up Candice.
Hi, my name is Candice Chan, and my topic focuses on the branding and the commercialization of pain. So in the recent years, the opioid crisis has become a topic synonymous with the United States, and its effects on towns, both big and small, have really dominated the headlines. So the goal of my project is to see how the changes in the definition of pain and its perception led to changes in marketing habits as well as consumption habits. The first section of my project lays out the 4 main phases that contributed to the shift in marketing within pain. The first being the creation of a strong sales force, followed by the definition of pain as a 5th vital sign, the prioritization of pain-related questions in patient discharge surveys, and the strategic alliances formed by big pharmaceutical companies. So as you scroll through these phases, if there's one that interests you, you can click on the thumbnail view of each advertisement to view an enlarged version and dig deeper down into the details. For instance, this advertisement shows how when Purdue Pharma introduced its blockbuster drug OxyContin in 1996, it gathered a team of 2,500 sales representatives to try to convince doctors to speak positively about it. And as you flip through the images, you can continue to learn facts per advertisement. For instance, how OxyContin used branded items such as hats, music discs, as well as mugs to try to spread its impact, or how the introduction of this phrase, pain as the 5th vital sign, and this numeric rating scale really promoted more aggressive prescription habits. So in order to connect the various marketing materials with how it influenced prescription habits, I created this chart to show opioids as a percentage of total prescriptions in clinics across different areas in the areas of medicine. And the intention behind this is to explore and heighten awareness of where people are most likely to encounter opioids, what types, and in which areas of medicine. And interestingly, while I was exploring the chart, I expected higher percentages to be linked to more serious areas of medicine, whereas in fact, you encounter them in more everyday and common areas of medicine, like the dentist or family practice. And as you can see, different areas of medicine have different or use different types of opioids, white representing long-acting and yellow representing standard opioids. And the epidemic becomes quite clear when you scroll the chart to the left, and it really reveals more points of who prescribes. So to dig deeper into the details behind each point, I created this cost chart to show how much each area of medicine spends and how much of that is really allocated towards opioids. So in this case, you can see internal medicine in California across the years 2013 to 2016 and how much is allocated towards each of those years. And my hope really is that with these collections of charts, my hope is to expand and highlight how different methods of marketing can really impact how people perceive or question the messages being advertised to them, and perhaps a better understanding of how the United States is configured to treat pain can place patients, instead of the big pharmaceutical companies, in the positions of power to determine how best to really manage their own pain. Thank you.
My name is Colleen McCaffrey, and my project is titled The Sum of Us, and it explores the question, what can crowdfunding tell us about the US healthcare gap? So what is the healthcare gap? Since 2013, medical expenditure per individual has increased 16.7%, and insurance premiums have increased 15%, all while salaries have stagnated. As of April 2019, health expenses account for almost 18% of the US GDP, which is highest of developed countries in the world, and trends over time show that this gap is only widening. With rising costs and stagnating salaries, people are turning to crowdfunding to supplement medical costs. GoFundMe is the #1 medical fundraising platform, raising over $650 million a year. I wanted to see what insights can be gained by taking a human-centered design approach to this data, and I analyzed it using a structured method of clustering by term frequency similarities. Not surprisingly, health was at the highest ranked of these terms. What I did find surprising was that the non-medical terms such as family and work were ranked just as high as the medical terms surgery and treatment. At the Techonomy Health Conference in 2017, Andrew Thompson stated that we don't have a healthcare system, we have a sick care system. And he continued to say that most of today's health challenges are actually dealt with in community settings, not in hospitals. The GoFundMe data supports this theory. I broke the clusters down into 2 categories, one being what Thompson would call sick care, cancer, treatment, hospital, and surgery, and the other what he would call health care, work, family, service, expenses, to see if there was a significant difference in the campaign's success for those categories. A third category also emerged, accidents, where we can see the top terms were fire, home, and lost. We can also see that the healthcare, sick care categories had similar success rates, with the healthcare category about family and work having the most campaigns that met or exceeded their goal indicated by the dark red, and an overall success rate of 43%, which is just slightly higher when compared to the sick care category. This tells us that both categories have evident needs and people are willing to contribute to both types of campaigns. You can also click through and explore the campaign's metadata and visit for updates on the GoFundMe site. The fact that most campaigns did not meet their goal was a little surprising. I think there's an assumption that GoFundMe campaigns are wildly successful, raising hundreds of thousands of dollars for expensive surgeries and life-saving treatments. This is especially evident when you visit the GoFundMe website, when in reality, the average campaign is far less successful. And the majority of campaigns do not reach their goal, which we can see demonstrated by some examples here. We also see a range of issues from addiction treatment, chemo, and cancer. And one story even tells us that the needs are more around access to the necessary medical treatment than it is for the treatment itself. When we look at the numbers broken down by group, we can see the average goal for all campaigns is between $10,000 and $20,000, which is comparable to the subset we just viewed and significantly less than the $100,000 to $200,000 campaigns we see featured on the website and in social media. We can also click through and see that the average number of donors is only 56. And when we see that while certain groups like those with top terms cancer, treatment, and surgery raise the most money, overall the average campaign only raises around $5,449. These numbers are not as astronomical as the original expectations of 6 figures, but they are still significantly higher than the $400 financial emergency the Federal Reserve study estimates the average household cannot afford. Crowdfunding has become a popular way for people to supplement medical costs, but it is likely not a sustainable solution due to the fact that digital literacy and extensive networks to share, promote, and donate are prerequisites to accessing this type of financial support. My hope is that by looking to the stories and needs of people first, this data can provide healthcare policymakers and civic-minded innovators new meaningful ways to consider a more integrative healthcare system. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Batool, and today I'm going to present to you Meddygon. Many of us have gone to the hospital to get our blood tested for one reason or another. However, when we get our blood test results back, they are usually conveyed in a complex format that leaves us puzzled about their meaning. Current formats are designed for health professionals, like doctors and nurses. These formats are heavy texted, they contain multiple units and ranges, and they lack visuals. So, I built a tool to better communicate blood test results to non-professionals like me. To get started, the first step is to start with the narrative page, where the user can go through all the features and get familiar with the interface. The second one is the data lab, which is the toolbox that allows the user to play around with the results freely. So starting with the narrative page, this page works as a guide for the user to explain the different features in the interface using animations. So starting with an example of a test result format, and then introducing the main 4 blood components. And then we use the complete blood count as an example throughout the narrative page. And introducing all the units that in the elements inside the blood components. And that leads us to the normalization. What is normalization, and why is it necessary in this process of visualization? And then the 4 polygons that represent all the 4 main group components, blood components. And finally, the normal range, how is it going to be represented in the polygon, using the hemoglobin as an example. Once the user is ready, you can click just ready, and then going to jump to the toolbox. The toolbox consists of 4 cards. Each card represents a blood component that is fitted in a polygon. So for example, the basic metabolic panel is fitted in a hexagon because it contains 6 elements in it. And the left window is the controlling window. It allows the user to input their demographic information and the BMI and the blood pressure. I'm going to use my own data for this as an example. I'm going to use complete blood count as well in this for the example. So on the right is my recent blood results I got from the hospital. I couldn't really tell where I'm standing in the normal range, even though it's listed there, but you can't tell from a first glance. In the polygon now, I can clearly see that there are 2 abnormal values because they're highlighted in black. And with this, just looking at the polygon, I can know where I stand in the normal range. And for more explanation, more information on, about the results is in this card. So I can also tell that I have some values that are almost off the range. The bar chart also represents how far you're away from the center of the normal range. If it's in the positive side, it's above normal. If it's in the negative side, it's under normal. And the 2 red lines, they represent the normal range. And once the user is done with inputting all the information, that includes the other blood components like the other three, the differential blood count, basic metabolic, and the liver function test. There's another feature that can export the results as a PDF, and that's going to lay out all the information you input. For my example is the complete blood count, and this is my results here. This could be useful for future purposes to visit a doctor or just to have it as a record. Finally, I believe that we should have access to our own data and to understand it. With just little of design thinking and data visualization, I think that could happen. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Felix Buchholz, and my project is titled Universal Income Guarantees, an Opportunity to Rethink Welfare. To start, I want to share with you my excitement to find new ways to talk about politics. And first coming to the US, I was really surprised to see how many passionate debates there are in this country. But I also realized that passion can become a problem when it leads to polarization. That's why I wanted to create a balanced, data-driven essay with open-ended user interaction to facilitate a more nuanced debate. And let me show you what I mean with universal income guarantees. No, sorry. Now we're starting that. I think of them as an income floor that nobody should fall below. For example, with this small family, if they have no income at all, they start with a full benefit, which is the blue area here. And as their income grows, the benefit slowly shrinks until they reach a break-even point. And after that, they become net contributors to the scheme. And different tax implementations are conceivable after that. But I didn't want to look only at the income progression of one small household, but I wanted to see how a universal income guarantee would change the overall distribution of incomes of households in the US. This is the income distribution in 2017 for 10 income groups. And the bars have different textures for just the income without benefits and just the welfare benefits. Because incomes in the US are so high incomes in the US are so high, I wanted to enable also a view on the lower income groups to see more detail there. When we activate a universal income guarantee now, with a slightly lower amount than the previous example, we can see that the situation of the 4 lowest income groups significantly improves, and even across those groups, the distribution is slightly more even. But we're also introducing a heavy cost in the overall balance by doing these changes of $560 billion, which is about 14% of the federal expenditure in that year. And this cost has to be financed somehow. And one idea to do this is represented in this graph. And the idea is to look at existing welfare programs and see which one of those could be replaced by a universal income guarantee. And as we hover over those groups I created, we can see which income groups benefit the most from existing welfare programs. As we start deactivating them, we can see that we get to actually quite huge savings of $1.4 trillion in this scenario. But as we activate the income guarantee again and now distribute it to the lowest income groups, we can see that these savings quickly melts away. And the turning point here is between the 5th and the 6th income group, where we get from a positive balance to a negative one. And if we want to stay on the positive side, we can see that our changes only improve the situation of the lowest income group, and all the other income groups experience a loss. We could now, of course, change the parameters of this scenario and find a satisfying solution. But I want to get to 2 conclusions right now. First, these are only static models. And when thinking about income guarantees, we also have to look at dynamic effects. And you should check out my website, the full project site, to see and learn about those. Second, of course, a lot of people ask me about my own take on universal income guarantees. And the honest answer is, I haven't decided yet. But my arguments are getting better and better. And I hope this interactive visual inquiry can be also an rewarding experience for you thinking about shared growth and join the debate. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Mikaela Ergas Lenett, and the project of my thesis is From the Supreme Court to the States, Visualizing Women's Reproductive Rights. So the topic of reproductive rights in the United States is one of particular contention. This past year, the United States has seen a rise in abortion legislation, and there are currently approximately 20 cases in the pipeline to be heard potentially by the Supreme Court. And without getting too much into the details of these cases, I think it's important to recognize that any one of these has the potential to significantly change the rights that were laid out in Roe versus Wade. So with this uncertain future surrounding the legality of abortion in the United States, and as a woman living in the United States, this definitely caught my attention. Hearing about these cases in the media made me curious about their effects on my life and other women's lives living in the US. It also made me wonder, how worried should I be about the decisions of the Supreme Court should these cases make it up there? And so my project seeks to explore these questions in order to determine if the decisions made by the Supreme Court contain any predictive value for women living in the United States. Using archival data collected by the Supreme Court, I created a timeline of all the women's reproductive rights cases from 1970 to 2017. And when I looked at all this data, I didn't just want to know what these cases were about. I was also interested in seeing who made these decisions, how were they made, and who was being impacted by them. So as you scroll through, you can see a horizontally moving red line. This line represents the number of women on the Supreme Court during each particular case. And it's contrasted by the number of women in the United States in the top right-hand corner. And so we can see throughout history, the first 11 years of cases, there were 0 women on the Supreme Court, yet hundreds of millions of women being impacted by these 9 justices' decisions. And hovering over this red line allows you to see images of the justices which are taken anytime there are changes to the makeup of the court. When I came across these images, I thought, what better way to visualize to visually communicate the lack of gender representation than to actually just show you what the court looked like and who exactly was deciding these cases. And as I went through these cases and learned about the justices' decisions, I was interested to know how these decisions were being implemented within the states. So each case summary is annotated in order to point out how the language used by the court is reflected in the present day. In the case of Lambert versus Wickland, we can see that this is about minors' rights, specifically parental consent, parental notification, and judicial bypass. Hovering over the annotations allows us to see if and where these decisions and restrictions are applied within the United States. By exploring this topic visually, I realized that the maps of these various restrictions revealed inconsistencies throughout the country. Women's reproductive rights in the United States are largely dependent upon where they live. So while the extent to which the Supreme Court's decisions are implemented within the states is difficult to discern, I think these maps suggest that there may be little predictive value in the Supreme Court's decisions. And so then I circle back to my original concerns in these 20 cases and that could potentially be heard by the Supreme Court, and how divisive this topic is. And for me to say I can't say anything for certain about the future of women's reproductive rights. However, as you go through my project by yourself, my hope is that it serves as an introduction to these issues and can be used to facilitate conversation about the future of these rights for women living in America. Thank you.
Thank you. So with this very timely subject, we're going to move on to media and society. So Alonso is going to look at Mexico through the lens of US media. Jed at the American Archive of Public Broadcasting, and Stephanie at an Oral History of Queens. Isabel is going to talk about passive activism, and Suzanna about the anatomy of a data breach. So, please, Alonso. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Alonso, and I'm going to talk to you about a year in news. So in 2016, I was part of the international media analysis team of the former president of Mexico. Our job consisted in creating a database of all the news that were published about the country and labeled them based on their content. So for example, positive articles tend to gravitate towards the successful application of a public policy or a signing of a new commercial agreement that can boost the economy. On the other hand, negative articles talk about security issues or immigration affairs or human rights violations. This sentiment analysis is crucial in our understanding of how Mexico is perceived by a foreign audience. So in the context of this presidential campaign, how did the US reader perceive Mexico? This is a question that I really want to know. So let's take a look. Here, I want to point out to this peak in September. This represents the meeting between the president and the Republican candidate. This event marks the future of the presidential campaign, and it's an unprecedented event in our shared political history. You would think that given the current political landscape, political news dominated the agenda, but that was really not the case. Security remained the most covered issue throughout the campaign. Now, interestingly enough, despite all the attacks on NAFTA, the economy was positively reviewed, as well as the social and tourist news. Mexico received a boost in tourism, and that was reflected by the media. As for my former boss, well, he didn't do so well, especially after that meeting. Now, let's take a closer look at the top 24 media outlets. These are outlets that published at least 60 articles throughout the year. Here, the user can hover over these circles to gain a more in-depth view of how the news are distributed across our classification spectrum. The user can take a view, and sort the media outlets by positive, negative, or informational. I want to point out the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and the Washington Post, since these were the newspapers that the presidency followed the most. The New York Times tend to be the most negative, despite the fact that it publishes less articles than the Wall Street Journal. The Wall Street Journal tends to be the most balanced, whereas the Washington Post remains pretty constant across the spectrum. I want to end on a positive note. Here I'm going to hover over the media outlets that are located across the border. Most of these media outlets are located in states that are Republican. Nevertheless, they have a positive outlook on Mexico. And I believe it is because they know that Mexico is a friend and a true commercial ally of the United States. So I learned a lot by exploring this information. And if you would like to know about the data behind it and the process that went behind this visualization, don't hesitate to contact me. You can click the link on my name right there. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. My name is Jed Crocker, and I'm here to talk to you about my project, which is a visual search tool for browsing something that's called the American Archive of Public Broadcasting. You'll be presented with a quote here in a moment that you don't need to read, but I think it is really boils down the essence of why American media, non-commercial media, is so important to our society. It is something that we've put a lot of public investment has gone into since the Public Broadcasting Act of 1967. And the value of this media is worth, calculate over $11 billion now. So I think the act of preserving this media, which is what the American Archive of Public Broadcasting does, is sort of the media equivalent of preserving and giving access to our national parks. So this archive consists of 2.5 million records that are searchable through their metadata online. However, only about 50,000 are available due to legal clearances and so on to be fully reviewed on the website. So the written portion of my thesis has to do with how climate change and environmental impacts have been depicted in public media over time. I wanted to share with you a brief excerpt of some of the footage that I've discovered using this tool to sort of paint a picture of how there is this media that's sitting out there to be found and explored and researched, and I'm hoping to present to you today a tool that does this in sort of a different way than just like searching a website, getting 10 results, and then looking for the next. So here's the website that I'm presenting to you. There's an introduction, and then you can go right to the search tool yourself to browse the items within this archive that are fully reviewable online. So I'm searching for terms of climate. The first visual view is a timeline histogram that presents the results by in chronological order by date. There's a persistent info panel on the right side of the screen where you can get information about the description, and then also a link to the entry directly itself. So here's what the archive looks like, where you can review the moving images and the radio programs. And this is an example of an environmental documentary from Oregon in 1982. The following view is a word cloud view where you can browse each entry via the associated transcript that all records have. These records are machine-learned voice-to-text, so they are imperfect in reading as far as a transcript goes, but very useful in determining what the most commonly used phrases are within each media entry. So if you are looking through here, you can determine if an entry is really valid about what you're interested in. Third view is a map view. And this is, I think, highlights a very interesting part about why public media is so important in this country, because the areas where this media is produced is meant to serve the region in which it was produced. So there's sort of a hyper-localism aspect to this media, and this is an example. There's many examples like this of state-specific news and magazine shows, like this example from North Carolina. So the map view highlights that. And then finally, there is the results are returned in the order of the predominant genre that they address. So all similar genres of entries are clustered together. For example, here, these are all talk shows. We're going to in format. The hollow circles are radio programs, the filled are moving images. The green items are global affairs, and so on and so forth. The orange items are going to be educational in nature. So this is just another way of exploring this archive information in a way that's visual and also a little random, and it fosters energy to sort of explore and find this content, which is very rich in value. And I hope that this is something that you will engage with and find interesting things for yourself. So thank you very much.
Hi, everyone. My name is Stephanie Shea Young, and I am a proud, lifelong Queens County resident. The cultural, linguistic, gastro, and socioeconomic diversity of Queens, which is a borough often referred to as one of the most diverse places in the world, has been the continual backdrop for my life. And this semester, I dove deep into Queens history, exploring the rabbit hole that is the 1940s New York City tax photos. This is our apartment in Woodside, Queens, from the tax archives, and then a Google Street View of what it looks like now. And also sites like Forgotten New York. Their Woodside tag has historic photos, stories of prominent persons, and maps and more. And this exploration situated me within the context and history of Queens. For my thesis, I worked with the Queens Memory Project, a program of the Queens Public Library, and their data set of over 500 oral history interviews about life in the borough. Queens Memory's mission is to document ordinary history and to empower residents by recording their unique voice and story. The oral history interviews range widely in length and scope. from 3-minute conversations with Queens Museum goers to hours-long interviews with lifelong borough dwellers who are able to recall a time when Queens was dotted with farmland. Was it possible to visualize the data of these interviews in a beautiful and meaningful way? What should or could be visualized from such a rich body of information? What is lost by not immersing ourselves in listening to full interviews and in the texture of dialogue and inflections, and seeking instead to capture in mind only select data points? An oral history presentation wouldn't be complete without hearing oral history, so I've sampled several interviews here for your listening pleasure.
My name is Natalie Milbrodt, and I'm sitting here with Councilmember Daniel Drum in his office in
Today
Jackson
is July
Heights,
22nd.
Queens.
My name is Eva
January
Tremaine,
30th.
and I'm at the Cambria Heights Community Library with Karen Teller.
And we are in Bayside, Queens, collecting an oral history interview.
Most begin by grounding you in time and location. And then interviewees go on to share their recollections of Queens.
Either Flushing
I came to America when I was 6 years old.
Yes, either Flushing or Jackson Heights for the whole time.
You know, one of the things that
when I was 2
my
months old,
parents and grandparents
my
always
mother
taught us
and father
was
moved
writing.
to
Writing
Astoria,
is
Queens,
huge in our culture.
still have
because
the same
we do a lot
apartment.
of storytelling. And so we
So we've seen the text data, we've heard some of the oral histories, and here's the visualization that I created. These top 100 words show what Queens residents spoke about the most frequently. People, Queens, time, years are among the top words. It's unsurprising that many people speak often about their families and the various life stages that they went through. Identity was also a common thread, and this cluster provides a glimpse into the diversity of the Queens Memory Project dataset. Some unique data points worth highlighting. The word fair, which is capitalized because Queens Memory collected interviews about people's memories of the 1939 and 1964 World Fairs that were held in Flushing Meadows, Corona Park. Words like street, park, avenue, school, also capitalized because these were places that loomed large in people's memories, and they were formative places where life and community happened, and interviewees would name them specifically. One specific line of dialogue that caught my interest was the topic of change. There were over 200 mentions of change within the data. What were the changes that stood out to interviewees, and how did they speak about the changes they witnessed in their neighborhoods? I was curious whether an interviewee's age, gender, identity, or neighborhood affect whether they discuss these changes in a negative or positive light. And as Queens Memory continues to refine its metadata collection and preservation methods, we'll be able to trace these lines of inquiry using data-based methods. Designing a visual entry point into this body of oral history interviews isn't meant to replace or overshadow the depth of spoken and heard oral history. Rather, it's an invitation to a broader audience, including you all, to engage with this dynamic testament of collective memory and to learn about the wonderful diversity of stories that populate the borough I call home. Thank you.
My name is Isabel, and I will talk about index funds, or passive investing. The phenomenon of passive investing is really amazing, and it enabled millions of people to benefit from capital markets and save for their retirements. But the increase of passive investing also had some negative side effects. And why is that? Why? Because the asset management industry is so concentrated. Right now, 81% of the index funds assets are with a few players, and combined have majority control over 88% of the S&P 500 companies, which means that they can basically determine together what happens at shareholder meetings. And that leads me to the question, if they have so much power, how do these fund managers vote on behalf of our shares? Well, you could actually look at this at the Securities and Exchange Commission's website. They have a tool, and you go and look for your own asset manager and then scroll through all the data and look at your fund, how it voted that year on every single ballot. But this data is so unstructured because there are thousands and thousands of items on the ballot. So it's very hard for me as an investor to know what's going on. And actually one of the SEC commissioners recently raised this issue in an interview.
So you don't think they're disclosing this? That's your issue?
Well, look, like a lot of things at the SEC, they disclose them, but believe me, I've looked at those filings and nobody can understand what they're actually doing. What you want to know is, in the corporate elections, are they voting for management? Are they voting for the other side? How are they actually using that money to vote? And you can look at our filings and try to figure that out, but we need to make it easier for investors to
Okay, so what's the answer? What does it look like?
So I started with looking at a visualization, right? And I started looking at the world's largest mutual fund manager, which is Vanguard. And I focus on an issue that has been increasingly on the ballot, environmental issues. And it's interesting that if over the 5 years of data that I collected and thousands of proposals, Vanguard is only voting in 2 cases, 2 oil companies with the environmental activists. The gray ones, the gray rectangles, are all against the activist and for management. And this sort of shows me how Vanguard is actually voting our money, how they are representing us shareholders in these shareholder elections. And it's interesting because if I know how Vanguard votes, if I know how Vanguard votes on environmental issues over 5 years, I have a better idea of a pattern, right? And I can see how they would vote maybe next year for similar cases. And allowing me to understand Vanguard, I obviously want to understand better how the other 2 big players are voting. So my next visualization is an overview, a more comparison view of BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street, the 3 biggest ones. And all the yellow rectangles are the times when they voted at least one time against management. And it's really astonishing to see that there are definitely differences between these index fund managers. Over the years, definitely, and also on environmental issues. It's State Street who stands out. So again, this data was public, but it was not really as understandable as how I like it to be. And again, to answer this question, I think my thesis was a first attempt to make it a little bit more understandable for us. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm similarly looking at data from data breaches. I'm specifically interested in identity theft. It's really impacting so many people across the world. One of the things that is out there is medical data. And HIPAA and high tech are some of the main 2 federal laws that are really about protecting the privacy and security of our healthcare records. And they actually require public notifications of data breaches, and you're welcome to click on this website and you can see the public notifications. Other laws that are out there, they don't require public notifications. So specifically, HIPAA covers electronic patient health data, which encompasses about 18 identifiers. And they're kind of categorized into different groups, such as names, biometric data, DNA, geographical data, data about our dates, specifically about numbers like fax numbers, social security numbers, and pretty much any other unique identifying number out there that can uniquely identify a person. So to begin with, let's look at some of the data that's been up there on OCR website. These are the top 3 breaches of this year. We can see that they were all reported within 3 or 4 days of each other back in February. One out in Washington State of over 900,000 individuals identities were breached. And this is public notification. You can see their notice. Some of the organizations actually put a notification out to the people. But what we really worry about during these breaches is identity theft. People can, once they have all of your information, they can buy properties in your name, they can open accounts in your name. It's really not easy to fix. You can't just call somebody and say, hey, I didn't buy that house down there. You have to show up in person, you have to go law, you have to use your vacation. So it really is a big problem. Specifically in the United States, there's 3 organizations groups that have to follow HIPAA and high tech. They're business associates, which is an entity or person that performs activities or services on EPHI on behalf of another covered entity, healthcare providers, such as your doctors, and then also health plans like Medicaid and Medicare. So of these 3 types that are covered under this, we can see that healthcare providers in the last year reported the most number of breaches, up there around 200, and the other ones reported less to OCR. And we can see also looking at how they're breaching, because that really informs the risk management at these organizations. So we can see that, healthcare providers are breaching data of individuals more in hacking and IT, whereas health plans really need to invest money in disclosure of their data. So, it really informs where they want to put in their controls, how they're going to budget their resources and their training of their staff. It's different in different places. Another thing that OCR reports on is a business associate agreement. And that's actually when an outside party receives the data on behalf of another covered entity. They should put in a business associate agreement inside there so that if there is a breach, not both parties are not involved with that. And OCR does say what across the states, how many different breaches had business associates agreement in place, and you can go on my website and you can sort through the different states and see what the breach result was. I've also put all of the breach results for individuals across the country in different states. This is just this 1 year from May 1st, 2018 to 2019, but you can go through and see how many individuals were breached in different states. And finally, in my presentation, I really wanted to see, how is data being breached? What does it look like? Not many people really understand that, so there's a poster up there you can download and look at. And then there's a nice visual representation of looking like phishing versus, losing a device versus misconfiguration. And you can kind of see how people are going along on the trail and they're a timeline chronological of how this happens and the resulting fines.
And finally, nominated in the category Data and Policy, we have Andrew with the US water crisis, Michael with the fragility of the Sahel, Grace with self-storage industry, Aaditi with the impact of climate change on flight experience, and Ryan on housing discrimination in New York City. Next up, Andrew.
Hi, I'm Andrew Levinson, and I'm going to talk to you about the United States water crisis, and specifically how changes to the natural water cycle and increasing demand are causing water stress that's often overlooked throughout the country. So let's get started with a little bit of background. First, why are we running out of water? If you think about it, we know where all the lakes are, we know where all the aquifers are. We're not going to discover anything soon. So as the populations keep growing and demand for water-intensive goods and services keeps growing, that number per capita is shrinking. It's also important to know where that water comes from. So we split that water between surface water at 61% and groundwater at 31%. And that'll be important later. It's also worth noting where that water comes from, specifically consumptive water use. So actually, irrigation is by far the highest amount of water withdrawal in terms of categorization at 63%. Municipal water, which is the water we come in contact with in our drinking water, at 22%. And then finally, industrial water, which is like in the products we buy, at 14%. Those are just the averages, though. It's important to look at a by-county breakdown at withdrawals per capita. And if you're familiar with the US, this isn't just the population centers. This is really concentrated around the high plains and the western regions, which are responsible for a lot of our agriculture. That's why this crisis is much bigger than personal consumption. So let's first take a look at some of the water stress events in the United States. We can look at what climate is doing with extended drought in the Colorado River Basin that's threatening the drinking water and agricultural needs to over 40 million people. We can look at flooding levels. We're in a period right now of very dangerous flooding this spring, which is expensive and dangerous and can affect agriculture and drinking water contamination. We can also go below the earth and look at our groundwater aquifers. And we can think of these aquifers as like the savings account of our water. It's okay to dip into sometimes, but we're very consistently depleting that water at a much higher rate than is being replenished. And after groundwater depletion, after the water is removed from the earth, we need to get it to where it needs to go. So what I'm showing right now is the EPA estimate and the billions of dollars that every state needs over the next 20 years in order to fix our busted and crumbling drinking water infrastructure, which can prevent contamination like we've seen in Flint, Michigan, but it can also stop the 6 billion gallons of treated water that are lost every single day to leaking pipes. That number is astronomical. You can see the total amount is at $472 billion for the whole country just for the next 20 years. So let's take a breath and talk about action. It might seem crazy to think about how we can affect $500 billion and spend groundwater depletion, climate change. So I built this little scenario model which compares behavioral changes against infrastructure investments. And we often can see that our behaviors might affect the water conservation numbers more than we think. So we can look at our direct usage of water. That's water we're most familiar with. That's water that comes out of the tap. We use about 123 gallons a day as Americans. But we could also look at our virtual water usage. This is often referred to as our footprint, and that's water that goes into the production process for our food, in our diets, for our energy, and for our products. We can compare those with infrastructure investments like the drinking water infrastructure I just mentioned, as well as combinations in billions of dollars that need to be spent on smarter irrigation methods, like conversions to drip irrigation and more efficient water use. So as I play around with the sliders here, these inputs, you can see the output and the circles. And the size of the circle represents the potential annual billions of gallons of water savings that could happen if we made these changes. And you can see even just a 5% reduction in our virtual water footprint, like changing our diet, can result in astronomical amounts of water savings. So I invite you to come visit this and see how much water you can save. It's live at thewatercrisis.us, and hopefully we can change our relationship with the most valuable natural resource on Earth. Thank you.
Glad you guys already took a breath during his talk because you're not getting one in mine. So, my name is Michael Wolf, and I would like to start off with an assertion. That is that the UN is responsible for billions of dollars in aid to developing countries every single year, to the tune of about $1/3 of $1 trillion in 2016 alone. Based on this, I wanted to ask a couple questions. First off, what sort of standards do we want to guide these sorts of aid initiatives, and what sort of resilient feedback mechanism do we need in order to make sure that these standards that we create remain relevant? So, in answering these questions, I turn to the Sahel region in Africa. These are 10 of the most vulnerable countries on the entire planet. In the past 10 years, each and every one of these countries has suffered systematic government destabilization, and all of them have suffered the repercussions of a megadrought that created millions of refugees as it left millions more people totally undernourished. For the purposes of this discussion, it's also important to say that the UN is there with an initiative right now trying to remediate the worst of the situation. Now, in order to look further into this, I read tons and tons of UN documentation about the Sahel region. What popped out to me first was this enormous, widespread use of this rhetorical notion of fragility. Now, fragility, I was wondering, how can the UN quantify the fragility of a country in the region? So I read more and created a ton of visualizations on it, and I'm going to share 2 of those with you right now. First off is from a general overview set of indicators that, among other things, measure economic, political, and social forms of fragility. Each country has its own associated diamonds. Tinier diamonds are better, and yellow and green are a lot better than orange and red. As we go from 2007 through to 2018, you can see that we end up with every country in the region being in the orange or red. This, of course, means that from these vantage points of economic, political, and social fragility, the region is far worse off in 2018 than when we started. Next, I went to a violent events database. Each one of these little dots that you're going to see on the countries is a violent event that happened in the region. Now, this chronicles essentially the same thing when the country has faced challenges over this period. From 2011 to 2018, it starts off in a reasonably okay place. However, as we move up to 2018, the entire region lights up. And what this says to us is, of course, from the standpoint of violent events and violence in general in the region, that the region ends up being far more fragile than it was when we started. Now, from this point, I went to try to find a sort of feedback mechanism of the sort that I described earlier in the talk, and I found one in the form of a set of UN-curated statistics that they keep for this initiative in the region. It's about 260 different statistics and serves at least 2 different purposes. First off, it informs their idea of their progress in the region, and secondly, informs them of the sorts of fragility in the countries in the region. Now, the second part is super important because when the UN has gotten this wrong in the past, this has caused them to use certain sorts of remediations that have been bad for the region, and among other things, have allowed transnational crime syndicates to flourish, making a bad situation worse. So you can imagine with all of this on the line that when I started looking at their own curated set of statistics, I found some wherein all 10 countries were reasonably well represented. However, I found several more where the 10 countries in the Sahel were underrepresented and others where they weren't represented at all. Now, the UN is doing good work in the region. However, these indicator sets that they have for feedback are clearly not working. By some experts' estimates, up to 62% of all the indicators that they're using for this purpose are completely non-trackable and offer no definitive information with regards to fragility or development in the area. Now, the obvious answer for this is that measuring fragility and development is an incredibly contingent set of problems that defies simple solutions like a simple set of metrics. To go back to the questions I asked at the beginning of my talk, what sort of standards do we want to guide our aid initiatives? Well, it turns out that the UN got this spot on. Fragility is an incredibly informative notion that can guide us to the weakest countries and suggest ways that we can help remediate the problems in these countries. That being said, what the nature is of this resilient feedback mechanism, this still remains a big question. That said, data on the ground is this current initiative that the UN has in the area ends in 2030. It started in 2016. We are more than 20% the way through. It is now the time to actually amplify whatever discussion we can create in order to better inform the UN on fragility and development in the region and guide their funding to the best possible outcomes. Thank you.
My name is Grace Martinez, and I'm going to talk to you about self-storage. So a few months ago, after binge watching the Marie Kondo Netflix show and seeing many people I know Marie Kondoing their homes, I couldn't help but wonder, are Americans actually getting rid of their stuff? Turns out we've been putting it in self-storage. The self-storage industry is basically a real estate business that rents out space to securely store people's stuff. And it's really profitable. It's now a $36 billion venture, which is twice as much revenue as the global music industry. There are now over 45,000 self-storage facilities in the US in comparison to Europe that barely has 3,000. So for my thesis project, I wanted to examine industry and survey data that visualize how customers participate in this industry and how self-storage may be a window into America's relationship to consumption. So it's no surprise that we consume a lot of stuff. Based on household final consumption expenditure in 2017 alone, US consumers spent over $13 trillion. That's nearly 3 times as much as the second largest consumer market, China. To get an idea of the scale of the industry, there's over 1.7 billion square feet of rentable storage space. That's nearly the size of Washington, DC. And when you add the total square footage of ubiquitous brands like McDonald's and Starbucks, it's only a fraction of that amount. So using 2017 self-storage demand survey data, I got a picture of the consumers of this industry. For starters, the customer base is pretty generally mixed evenly, with the greatest generation, which is the oldest generation, being the smallest. And when we look at what people are actually storing, it's a lot of the same stuff we have at home. It's like houseware, furniture, personal items. Each generation's, they're pretty similar. The biggest difference was that the greatest generation stores the most holiday items. And when we look into why people are storing, the top reasons are that people don't have enough space at home, and as a temporary storage as they change residence. Why is this the case? Well, the first reason suggests that we're either consuming more stuff than we have space for, and or our living spaces have shrunken, which is definitely true in the major cities where this industry is thriving in. The second reason suggests that these generations are migrating a lot more, and we see that the most with millennials. But what I found most interesting about this data was that how many Americans turn to self-storage during important parts of their lives. From death to divorce to relocating to a new job, people turn to self-storage, but it's at a cost. So it led me to question, is this worth it? To answer this, I need to know the length of time people are actually renting. The average is about 2 years, and half customers only visit their unit maybe once a month. So at the 2-year mark, with a monthly average cost about $90 a month, the average customer is spending about $2,100 total. However, when I break down the cost of each unit, the contents are only worth roughly $2,000, and that's actually being very generous, considering that the average price of a storage unit at auction is $425. And of course, this is just an estimate because we tend to ascribe more value to items simply because we own them, and it's really hard to quantify items that have nostalgic value. But that being said, the point at which the average storage unit would definitely start losing money is just below 2 years. So unless you're using self-storage for its original intention, a truly temporary space to keep your stuff, it's not worth it. And of course, there are exceptions like we see in Storage Wars. But rarely do we find such treasures in our units. The typical storage unit is filled with junk, so using self-storage becomes akin sometimes to a gym membership, an unused added subscription. So Marie Kondo's organizing philosophy is to first pile up all of one's stuff in order to grasp its volume, and then assess the value of the items one by one, only keeping what is necessary and parting with the excess. But millions of people have opted for a different version of this ritual, sending their pile to self-storage. Is it worth it? The answer lies with its owners. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Okay. So I'm Aaditi. Just give me a second. All right. So I'm Aaditi, and I have visualized the impact of climate change on flight experience for the domestic travel sector of India. Flight experience is caused by flight cancellations. I mean, it's one of the reasons contributing towards it. And that is why I'm focusing on flight cancellations. In 2018, there were around 1,800 flight cancellations, affecting 108,000 people, which made industry to shell out around $308,000, which is a lot of amount. With years, more and more people are taking flights. And that's why it's important to look into these flight cancellations. Now, these flight cancellations are caused by various reasons. Some of them are commercial, some technical, operational, and also bad weather conditions. Okay, so at high temperature, the density of air goes down, and the wings of aircraft cannot produce enough lift for its takeoff. And we see that the temperature is increasing with years. In heavy rain and cloudy weather, the safe operation of a flight becomes very difficult. And we also see that the rainfall is also increasing with years. Now, this particular visualization shows the flight cancellations against distribution of temperature and rainfall for each month of last 5 years. The pie chart shows the contribution of weather towards these cancellations. It suggests that the contribution goes high in the high temperature months of summer, and some months that are overlapping between summer and monsoon season. This means that with increasing temperature and rainfall, the effect of climate is going to be heightened as well. I decided to take a step further into this exploration and compare different airlines for their flight cancellation history for last 5 years. Now imagine that you have taken a short, you are planning for a short vacation and you're planning to travel domestically in India. And you decide to book a flight with TrueJet Airlines. If you're planning to travel in July, you might want to consider an alternate airline. So this particular tool also helps you to look at all the airline carriers at the same time, to compare them. Another thing it does is you can look at the upcoming holidays and see, India has many holidays and people tend to travel in the festivals. So it's kind of fun to explore which festival you should travel on. And so the entire idea behind this exploration is to make passengers more aware of the impact of climate change on this flight experience and probably help them make more informed decisions while they travel. Thank you so much.
Hi, everyone. My name is Ryan Best, and I'm here to talk to you tonight about my thesis project, Drawing Discrimination.
which explores the lasting impact of redlining and housing discrimination on wealth building opportunities across New York City. So first, for a little background. In the mid to late 1930s, it was a prevailing notion that homes in white neighborhoods were worth a lot more than homes in non-white neighborhoods. This excerpt from the 1938 FHA underwriting manual really underlines how the federal government adopted these discriminatory policies into its national policy of the time, officially making homes in white segregated neighborhoods more valuable than homes in non-white or mixed-race neighborhoods. Now, part of this policy in the late 30s was commissioning of maps across the country, of which over 250 were created, right? And in these maps, they had appraisers go neighborhood by neighborhood to evaluate the perceived risk of a real estate investment for houses and mortgages in each neighborhood. And the way these appraisers determined risk levels were through race. So on the low end of the spectrum, you had red line zones. These are more areas where appraisers were more likely to see non-white or immigrant communities living in these boundaries. On the other end of the spectrum were neighborhoods where appraisers thought these were the best real estate investments. These were much more likely to have homogeneous white communities in segregated neighborhoods. And then in the middle, you had neighborhoods that were perceived to be still desirable or declining real estate investment. Now, the discrimination reflected in these maps and all the neighborhoods within it, which were part of official federal policy from the Great Depression until civil rights legislation in the late 60s, really influenced who had the opportunities to build wealth in the housing market by determining where people could get mortgages they would need to buy their homes and where those homes were deemed valuable. So what I decided to do is I took the neighborhood boundaries in these maps and I connected them with changing census data from 1940 to 2010, looking at the racial composition, home ownership rates, and home values in each of these neighborhoods. So now we're gonna look at a couple case studies of neighborhood comparisons that I think tell compelling stories of how this discrimination might have influenced the wealth building opportunities for the decades after. First, we're gonna go to Upper Manhattan and look at Harlem and the Upper East Side. Redline Harlem was one of the only majority non-white neighborhoods in 1940s New York when it shared very similar homeownership rates as the Upper East Side. In the decades since, homeownership in the Upper East Side continued to climb, where it's now over 4 times the amount of homeownership in the redlined area in Harlem. Also, thanks to some great record keeping by the New York's tax department, which you've seen a glimpse of before, and the Google Street API, which you've seen a glimpse of before, we can actually look at individual houses in each of these neighborhoods, getting a snapshot of what they might have looked like in 1940 when the appraisers were making their decisions and what they look like now. Next, we'll go to Staten Island, where a Green Line neighborhood named Todd Hill shared very similar racial demographics and home values as a redlined area encompassing nearby New Brighton. Now these areas look a little bit different in their racial compositions, and Todd Hill has become one of the most exclusive and expensive markets in the borough, with home ownership rates and home values more than double that in the redlined area to its northeast. And now finally, we'll go to Brooklyn, where a majority white community in Brighton Beach actually has not seen a lot of housing market gains outpacing majority minority neighborhoods, like this in Crown Heights. And the reason for this is Brighton Beach is home to a big immigrant community. There's a lot of Russians and Jews that have made this neighborhood their home. And these people were seen as detrimental influences to property values and also received a considerable amount of housing discrimination, but are included alongside native-born whites in my white, non-white distinction that I study in my research. But all this to say, right, New York is not 6 neighborhoods, and there's so much that influences what happens in housing markets block by block and year by year. So I wanted to open this map up for exploration. So if you're interested in seeing what a late 30s redlining map of New York looked like, looking at neighborhoods that you know or you live in, or investigating these potential threads of housing discrimination on your own, I invite you to check out the live version of this visualization on my webpage. And also thank you for your time and spending your evening with us. Thanks.
Thank you. This concludes the 2019 Data Visualization Keynotes. Let's give a hand to the class of 2019. All of these projects are available at parsons.nyc. If you're wondering, you can dig into them, and we welcome you for some refreshments here afterwards with us. So I hope you got a sense of data visualization, some answers to that question, and also how that future looks like. I'm thrilled that you're part of that future. So congratulations.